Good morning. And it's not a bad morning today, which makes a change from the dreich weather we've been having recently. So, previously I've been talking about making nets. That was fun. And also the bone whirrer. Do you remember that? I was told by someone that it made something like the sound of the seashore on the beach in Norway, and that is great. I wonder if I can get it going again. It takes a while to get up in the morning, although it's almost lunch now. Aha! Bone one works really well. I wonder if anyone has made any bone ones. Can you hear the noise? Perhaps it would put you to sleep if you were feeling all agitated after a day. Or perhaps it can just put your mind at rest so that your imagination can wander far and free. You can join me in the land of stories, where, well, stories are interesting. You get different types of story. Some stories we tell to try and remember what has happened. And perhaps for that story to be good, it needs to match the events. And match the record of the events as has been recorded by the most people possible. It's really hard to get the full picture. But if you can get something that loads of people agree on, then that's pretty good. But then there's other stories. Stories that are just for fun. And there are stories which will deliberately put one thing against another thing in an absurd way and make you laugh, because that's the only possible response to, I don't know, to something breaking and going wrong. Well, it's not the only possible response, but it's probably one of the better ones. Because after you've laughed, then you can fix things. But yeah, stories are just for fun. And then there's another type of story. And that's a story that mixes a bit of what has happened with a bit of what is for fun, and allows you to imagine the way that things could be, even if it isn't exactly how they were. And that all sounds really confusing. But perhaps there are stories that we tell so we can imagine who we can be. And then the importance isn't so much whether the thing happened exactly the way it's described, as the importance being that when you tell the story, or when you listen to the story and enter into it, you can think about your life and think about the life described in the story and decide what parts you'll take from the story, and they'll make you strong and they'll make you better in your life. And the test of it is whether it helps you or not. And if it doesn't help you, then try another story. And there's a lot about stories that are stories about stories, and big meta stories, and stories that can tell us how to understand stories, but that's far too complicated for this morning. So today I'm going to tell you a story about Brigid. Now, Brigid is a very, very old name. In fact, some would call Brigid a goddess, and the name that the island of Britain is named after. And there was a tribe called the Brigantes. Maybe they followed Brigid, and that's why they were called that. Just like the Tuatha De Danann followed Danu, the mother goddess. Maybe. Maybe Brigid was a smith god. Not one that did the actual hammering. That was Govan. And but the God that put the fire in the mind and the burning in the heart that means that when you hammer, you produce things of beauty. Sort of an inspiration. But for the purpose of this story, all you need to know is that there was once a slave who was captured and sold to a chieftain in Ireland. Much in the same way as St. Patrick was captured as a slave, and he spent years looking after sheep on a hillside. Probably this woman was from around Galloway or across the water in Cumbria, and she was a Christian. But still, slavers came to capture her, and she lived in the Dun, the fortress of this chieftain. And, well, the chieftain wanted her for a slave to do work, to grind the corn and all that sort of thing, but also, eventually, she had a child, and the child was a daughter, and the chieftain decided to call the daughter Brigid. Well, there were probably a fair few slaves in his Dun who had children, and maybe he acknowledged some of them, maybe he didn't. But the thing about being a slave is that you're invisible, just in the background. And for all the stories you hear and all the legends of great warriors with swords and shining spears, there's a whole raft of slaves doing the hard work and keeping the food in the bellies of everybody. And they just are invisible in the stories because they don't own anything. And even more than that, if they have anything, then that is owned by the person who owns them. Now, you might think that that's a hard way of life, and perhaps you're right. But how would you react to that? Would you be bitter? Would you make sure that if you managed to find something that you could call your own, you kept it close to you, safe, secret? Maybe there are very few options in a lifestyle like that. This story is about when Brigid had a choice. Because she was a child of the chieftain. He reckoned her his property. And being his property, he wanted to make good on the investment. And the story goes that Brigid was really, really beautiful. Fantastically pretty. So he wanted to give her as a gift to the King of Leinster. Maybe the King of Leinster was like his boss. So how would he go about that? Well, perhaps he put really good clothes on her, give her a ring on the finger and a fine belt and a circlet of silver, maybe, because she was his, and he would want her to be decorated the best way possible when he was going to give her as a gift. How would you feel about that? Maybe you'd like the clothes. Maybe you would see it as going from a job, a daily life where you had to get up before dawn and take the animals out, dig ditches, working with your hands all the time. And this would be a better way of life, where you would have fine clothes and you could sit near the fire in the Dun, beside a great king, and take your place in the world. Maybe not be recognised as you, but at least you would be recognised, seen, and fed, and warm. And maybe Brigid, having been brought up as a Christian, remembered stories of Queen Esther of the Israelites. And Queen Esther, she became queen because she won a beauty competition, and she became a concubine to a great Babylonian king. And through that, she managed to save all of her people from extinction, from being wiped out when that king decided, when one of the king's advisors decided that he wanted them all dead. And that was a path that perhaps was open to her. Brigid, however, had another idea in mind. She was so devoted to God, to the Christian God, that she wanted to be married to him and would have none of this. Her great beauty, she didn't care for. She didn't trust in, she didn't trust in possessions because she didn't have any. She didn't trust even in the beauty that she had that was in her body. And she'd chosen, perhaps, to make the slavery into a way that she could show the glory of God even in the hardest circumstance. So when the king had her all glammed up and taken away on the chariot, to this meeting with the King of Leinster. The king left his sword in the chariot to go in and meet. The chieftain, sorry, had his sword left in the chariot when he went in to go and meet the King of Leinster. And Brigid's sitting there, and there she is with all of her stuff, and she sees a leper come along. What does she do? She takes the jewelled sword of the chieftain who's taking her to see the king, and she gives it to the leper so that the leper can sell it and have food. There was no national way of looking after people at that time, and if you were ill, you starved. If you had a skin disease like leprosy, then you were kicked out of the community, just in case you spread it to anyone else. So it depended on people like Brigid, when they had the opportunity, giving things to people who needed it. What do you think the chieftain felt when he came back to his chariot, maybe with the King of Leinster as well, to show him the new gift that he'd brought, the new bride that he'd bought for the King of Leinster? And then finding out that while he'd been away, while his back was turned for a moment, she'd given away his prize sword. Maybe he'd be furious. But then, here's the thing about status and rich people. They have to show that they're rich. They have to show and pretend that all these goods mean nothing to them, because the more you can give away in this culture, then the more you show off that you have. The chieftain was giving away this beautiful slave to the King of Leinster to show off that he could do these things. Sounds like a gift. It's more like a power statement. And Brigid, in handing over the sword, had made herself ugly, had made herself not the sort of wife the king wanted. She'd shown that she had a strong will, that she was willing to take risks, willing to face punishment, but had done it in such a way that nobody could reproach her for it. Because if the chieftain said that, if the chieftain beat her for it, then the chieftain would look like he was ungenerous, and that is the worst thing he could look like. The King of Leinster, on seeing this, was a canny man, and he declined the offer of the wife as a gift, whilst praising her beauty and generosity, and suggested that perhaps such a person as this could only be dedicated to God, and only be dedicated to God in a monastery. After all, that was her wish, and she was so good at it, she could live in a monastery. But what is life in a monastery like? At that time, well, maybe people in monasteries looked a little like slaves. They wore the cheapest wool clothes, that which was commonly available, and there was no restriction on colour as much as making sure that the clothing that came in was adequate and good for what it needed to do, but not fancy and not showing off. You didn't own anything living in a monastery. The monastery owned things, and you were given from the stores. So you could have 2 shirts so that you didn't need to walk around naked when one of them was being washed. But neither of those shirts were really yours. They were fitted to your size, so perhaps you wore the same one more often than not. But everything was owned by the community, and that suited Brigid's way of life because she was used to it. And she thrived in that environment, and her good-naturedness, her strong will, and maybe her canny wit that meant that she could laugh when things went wrong, gained her a good reputation. And in the monastery, that reputation was encouraged and fostered, and she grew in skill and in piety, in knowledge of God, and in love for other people. So much so that at one point she was commissioned to go and start a monastery of her own. Now, there's discussion about who it was who commissioned her, and whether it was a monk on the Isle of Man, or maybe from Galloway, who told her that she could go out. But one thing that's agreed is it was a breaking in tradition, because at that time there were people called leaders in the church. They're called bishops now, and these people would go out, and they would, in the Irish setting, they would found monasteries, places where people could gather together to devote themselves to understanding the higher things in life, like art, theology, philosophy. They linked in with the Druids and the bards and the telling of stories. And they brought wealth to the area in terms of food and in managed fields, and resilience, because if there was a famine, then the wise storing up of things in monasteries meant they could be redistributed to the poor. And even in normal times, if you were in a hard place, you could go to a monastery and pray for healing, or be given food, or be introduced to the wonderful world of herbs and diets that can bring you better life. There's also a story that Brigid was commissioned by a Druid, even at the time of her birth. There's a story that a Druid walked out to the forest and said to the Christians that he'd met that he had been told by the true God, maybe he said the Dagdamor, who knows, that this Brigid would spread a mantle over the whole of Ireland for its protection. And he gave her a cloak. Another word for a cloak is a mantle. And that cloak was maybe sky blue. Maybe that part is an imaginary part of the story that means that when you look up in the sky and you see it blue at night with the stars shining in it, you can see Brigid's cloak covering the whole of everything. Maybe. Or if you look at the Queen of the South, there's a name that might be familiar to some people. Perhaps you can think of Brigid. Or perhaps you'll think of Mary, Mother of God as well, the Queen of Heaven. Who knows? But back to the story, yes, because Brigid was commissioned to go and set up a monastery. Now, the words monastery, abbey, nunnery, they're all technical words, and they have very important meanings if you want to get into the meanings of things. But understand this perhaps as a community, and it was a community with women living married to God and men living married to God. And their devotion was to God rather than to building up an earthly family. And they would build up the heavenly family on earth instead. And the other curious thing, rare thing, was that Brigid was in charge of both of them. Because the gifts that God had given her, she used. And when you use your gifts, you're given more. Even if you own nothing yourself. Or perhaps especially if you act as if you own nothing. Anyhow, being commissioned and sent back to Ireland to start up this colony of heaven, Brigid needed a place to build it. And she looked around and she found a beautiful place, a valley with water, with pasture for cattle and grass for growing crops, where the trade routes met, where you could bring in iron ore for smelting and hammering metal. Maybe it would be a bit like Hodham in Dumfries and Galloway. The problem was she needed permission to set it up, and the chieftain of that place wasn't keen to give away anything like that. So they had a meeting. Maybe they had the meeting on the place where she wanted to build the monastery. And at that meeting, well, the chieftain wasn't for budging at all. This was good land, he wanted it for himself. So Brigid prayed. And when she prayed, she was given inspiration. And she asked him, well, could I just about have as much land as my cloak can cover? And the king thought, oh yeah, okay, there's no problem in giving that away. I can do that, no problem. So he said, yeah, sure. You can have as much land as your cloak can cover. And then Brigid prayed again. And 4 of her followers stepped forward, and she gave each of them one corner of the cloak. And she told them to walk. And one walked to the north, and one walked to the south, and one walked to the east, and one walked to the west. And as they walked, the cloak stretched and grew until it covered enough land to build a great colony of heaven. And when they laid it down, the king was so amazed and so convinced by this proof that he willingly gave it to her. And from that day on, that chieftain also became a follower of Christ. Not through his faith perhaps, but through the faith of the bride that then brought him to greater faith. Now, all these stories happened a long, long time ago. 1,000 years? No, longer than that. 1,500 years? Perhaps around that time. And all the stories link to things that are beyond time itself. So when you hear them, if you hear something that's good, remember it, treasure it, and use it in a story yourself sometime. Use it in the story that you make your life to become. The way to test it is to look at the history of the British Isles, of Ireland, and there are times of great trouble. There are times when things break, but there are times when you can laugh as well. And at this time, if you look around, 1,500 years after the life of Brigid, people are still talking about what she did. And they're talking about what she did because she talked about the life of someone from 2,000 years ago. And I am a servant in that tradition and will continue to tell stories. This one and other ones, and I'll tell stories about making things as well. So this week on Tuesday and Wednesday, if you come back, then I'll be telling some stories. Yeah, I'll go for some Viking stories on Tuesday because Vikings can be great pirates and it can be great adventure and that can be fun. And on Tuesday, I'm going to show you how to write in runes or carve in runes so that you can make secret coded messages to your friends. And then Sundays again, I'll be back round about 11 o'clock, blethering away telling stories about saints. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention and for listening, and I hope that today becomes an excellent new chapter in your life. Thank you.